All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we are diving headfirst into some seriously deep waters. Buddhist philosophy.
Yeah, we're talking about the illusion of the self.
We're tackling some fascinating excerpts that you've provided. Um, and honestly, this stuff is both ancient and incredibly relevant to how we live, like right now.
It is. And these Buddhist texts, I mean, they can be pretty dense,
They are.
but they really offer like a radical shift, a shift in perspective from what we're used to in Western thought.
I think that's a great place to start because, yeah, in the West, we often think of the self as this kind of solid, unchanging me at the center of everything, experiencing, thinking, feeling. But these texts are saying, like, hold on, what if that me isn't as solid as we think? What's going on there?
Well, what's really cool here is how these texts actually deconstruct this idea of like a permanent self.
Hmm.
For example, they'll ask, if there's an unchanging self, how do you explain all the ways that we change in our lifetimes? I mean, learning, growing, our personalities, none of that stays the same.
It's so true. Even thinking about myself, like, I am not the same person I was a year ago.
Right.
Okay, so say that's the case. Who is actually doing all of this changing then? Who's making choices? Who's creating karma and then experiencing the results if there is no fixed me?
And these are really the big questions that these texts are grappling with. And they're pointing out that like this idea of a permanent, unchanging self, it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. It can't logically account for all of the very real transformations that we see in ourselves and in the world around us.
So to clarify, are these texts saying there's no self at all? That we're
Yeah.
just nothing? Because I got to be honest, that's what I thought at first. And it's kind of unsettling.
It's definitely unsettling, and I think it's understandable to feel that way. But these texts aren't really saying there's no self. What they're doing is they're offering a radical alternative, and that's the self as a constantly evolving process. So think of it like a river.
Okay, a river. I like that. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Okay, so a river, right? It's always flowing, it's always changing, it's never the same from one moment to the next, yet we still call it the river. So it has this continuity, but the water itself is always changing.
So are you saying we're not a fixed thing, but more like this dynamic process, this constant state of becoming?
Exactly, exactly. And this becoming is rooted in what Buddhism calls the five aggregates: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. And these aggregates, just like the water in the river, are always in flux, always changing.
Okay, I definitely want to unpack these five aggregates because I think that's where things might get really confusing for people, including myself.
Yeah.
So what do these aggregates actually mean in terms of just like our everyday experience?
So let's start with form. Form refers to everything that we perceive with our senses. Sights, sounds, smells, tastes, even like the physical sensations in our body. It's the tangible physical world both outside and inside of us. Then you have sensations, which are our pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feelings in response to all those forms.
So like even right now, I'm aware of the sound of my voice. I can feel the chair I'm sitting on. That's all part of form and sensation.
Exactly. And then you have perception, which comes next. That's how we recognize and categorize those forms and sensations. So you're not just hearing sounds, you're perceiving them as words and as language.
Oh, wow. Okay. This is already blowing my mind a little bit. So
Okay.
we're taking in information through our senses, we're reacting to it emotionally, and then we're making sense of it all in our minds.
Yeah, you got it. And then we have mental formations. So that's all the thoughts, ideas, opinions, beliefs, biases, all that stuff that colors how we see the world.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just what we perceive, but then our own minds kind of shape those perceptions in a way, right?
Mhm.
Like I'm imagining, for example, one person could see a spider, be totally fascinated, and then someone else like freaks out.
Exactly. And then last but not least, you have consciousness itself. And that's the knowing faculty that's aware of all these other aggregates. So it's like the canvas that all of these experiences are kind of being painted on.
Okay, so essentially everything, our bodies, senses, thoughts, emotions, even our awareness, it's all kind of like that river you were talking about, right? It's constantly in flux.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The texts suggest that this clinging to this idea of like a fixed self, that's really us mistaking these impermanent aggregates for something that's actually solid and unchanging.
So we're kind of building our sense of me on top of something that's constantly shifting, like sand. No wonder it's called the illusion of self.
Exactly. It's like trying to grab onto smoke. The harder you grasp at it, the more it just slips through your fingers. And this clinging, this grasping at a self that's inherently unstable, that's what the Buddha pointed to as like a root cause of suffering.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that would lead to suffering.
Yeah.
For example, if my identity is wrapped up in my job and I lose my job, that's going to be devastating because I'm clinging to that as part of myself.
Absolutely. Or like if you're really attached to a particular outcome, you really want to win something or have someone like you and then things don't go your way, that clinging to how we want things to be, that's suffering.
Right, right. The more we invest in this idea of a fixed self, the higher the stakes we put on everything. And of course, the more potential there is for disappointment. So if we accept that this self isn't this fixed thing, that it's always evolving, does that mean we should just stop caring about everything?
That's such a good question. And it gets at like the core of what these Buddhist texts are pointing to. They're saying recognizing that the self is an illusion doesn't mean we stop caring. It actually means that we can experience life, including the joys and sorrows, with even more wisdom and compassion.
Okay, I'm not sure I totally understand. How does that work? If we're not clinging to this sense of self, how do we not just, like, fall apart?
Well, these texts actually talk about two main ways that we cling to the self. The first one is like a primal instinctual clinging. That's like the kind that arises at birth. And it's kind of hardwired, like the survival instinct that makes you pull your hand away from something hot.
Okay, so that makes sense. It's just like our basic instinct to protect this me, even if that me isn't as real as we think it is.
Yeah. And then the second type of clinging, that's more about the self that we construct based on all our experiences, our upbringing, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are.
So that's where things like culture, family, even social media come in, right? We're always told who we should be, what to value, how to look.
Right. And all those messages get all mixed up with this constructed sense of self. But the good news is, with this type of clinging, we can work with it.
So we're not talking about erasing our personalities or pretending our experiences haven't shaped us. It's more about like noticing those stories we tell about ourselves.
Yeah.
And just recognizing that they're stories.
Exactly. And those stories, like the aggregates themselves, they're impermanent, always changing. We don't have to be defined by them.
Man, this is really giving me so much to think about. But I have to ask, if we let go of this fixed idea of the self, what happens to like our memories, our relationships? Does that all just disappear?
Well, remember that river analogy. The water's always changing, but the river still flows, right? Our experiences, memories, and relationships, they're all part of that flow of consciousness. But the self experiencing it, that's always evolving.
So it's like the river carrying with it, like the memory of the mountains it flowed down or the valleys that it carved. Even though the water itself, that's always changing.
Yes, exactly. There's a continuity of experience, even with this idea of like an impermanent self.
So it's not that we erase everything, all these experiences, with this understanding of non-selves.
Yeah.
But it's more about seeing those experiences in a new light, right? Like they don't define this fixed me.
Yeah, you're getting it. And this shift in perspective, this understanding, it has like big implications for how we live our lives.
I mean, it's almost like we're trading in this rigid self-portrait for something that's more like, I don't know, a tapestry that's always evolving.
I love that. That's a beautiful way to put it. And this dynamic self, recognizing that it doesn't like diminish our experiences, it can actually make them even better.
I could see that because we're more present, right?
Yes.
We're not caught up in always defending this idea of who we are.
Exactly.
There's freedom in that.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to like those practical implications we were talking about. Like this isn't just some kind of intellectual exercise, this whole idea of non-self. It's like actually a path to liberation, to suffering less.
Because, I mean, I guess it's like when we're so attached to this idea of self, anytime something doesn't go our way, when we experience loss, when things change, which of course they always do, it's like we suffer more.
Exactly. Exactly. But when we can see through that illusion, right, we can still go through those challenges, but we don't have to be so completely consumed by them.
So we're not getting rid of our emotions, we're not getting rid of these experiences, but we're changing how we relate to them.
Yes, exactly. And then we're less likely to be like controlled by our emotions, less reactive, more compassionate to ourselves and others.
It's like, I don't know, instead of being tossed around by a wave, it's more like learning to surf.
Yes. I love that analogy. It really captures it. It's like we're not immune to the storms, but we can learn how to navigate them with grace, with skill.
Okay, so last question. And I know you probably can't answer this completely, but for someone listening who's like, okay, I think I get it. How do we actually do this? How do we cultivate this understanding of non-self?
Well, that is the journey, right? Like these texts, they're a starting point, a framework, but the real work, that happens through practice. Meditation, mindfulness, paying really close attention to how this clinging to self shows up in our everyday lives.
So it's like taking that intellectual understanding and then it has to become something that we live.
Exactly. And it's a lifelong journey, but the rewards, they're really immeasurable.
Well, I gotta say, my mind is officially blown.
Mhm.
And honestly, I feel like we're just scratching the surface of this stuff.
Oh, yeah, we're just dipping our toes into this vast, vast ocean.
But what an amazing dive it has been. Listener, I'm going to leave you with a question, and it's something I hope you'll take some time to really think about. If, like these texts suggest, our sense of self is always changing, always in flux, then what does that open up for us? What choices become possible when we realize that who we are is not this fixed thing, but actually this boundless, ever-evolving potential? Thanks for joining us.